Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Scottish Independence Podcasts. And this one has a distinctly historical feel about it because we're going to be looking at the Battle of Loudoun Hill. Now, if you're like me, you'd never heard of the Battle of Loudoun Hill.
Nor me.
So the first I knew about it was when Neil, who is one of our podcast roving reporters, sent me some footage from Loudoun Hill. Because we knew nothing about it, either of us, we thought we would tap into our favourite Scottish history consultant, Jenny Eeles. And Jenny, of course, always happy to come on the show, joined us and gave us some historical background.
I did get as far as finding out just exactly where Loudoun Hill is. I didn't even know that, actually. I mean, it's down in Ayrshire, East Ayrshire, I think.
If you'd like to see the pictures and some of the footage that Neil sent us, they're on our YouTube channel and I'll link to them in the notes below. One curious aspect is that, according to the map, the earthworks there are called Wallace's Grave or Wallace's Now. But was Wallace even at that battle? Let's hope Jenny can sort that out for us.
Yeah, just want to tell us a bit about the battle, Jenny.
I mean, you can see from your picture there, it's excellent terrain, and that was really where Bruce was at his best, was in terrain tactics and just planning ahead to the area of a proposed battle, and they would arrange that. So for months leading up to the battle, there were ditches being dug and plans were being made to really get the right setup in order to wangle the English troops, the opposing faction, into having to approach from a certain angle, having to take certain routes, and then being hemmed in when it came to the battle. I mean, Bruce had already kind of shown his forte, if you like, in that regard. You're talking about Wallace, and Wallace had been betrayed and executed about 2 years previous to this battle.
Right.
Although Blind Harry, if he's to be believed, there had been a previous Battle of Loudoun Hill in 1296, where Wallace was supposed to have taken a lead part. But Blind Harry is more a dealer of myths and legends than he is of facts. So the actual Battle of Loudoun, of which there are historical records, was 2 years post-Wallace. It was Bruce who was very much taking a lead in this, and he was right in amongst the melee as far as the reports are concerned. He wasn't one of these leaders that hung back and just watched and directed and delegated folk. He was right in amongst it, you know. The previous year you had the Battle of Methven, where about 4,000 Scottish troops were killed, and that was actually by the faction headed by Aymer de Valence, who was the Earl of Pembroke, the second Earl of Pembroke. And it was actually said Aymer de Valence who was the opposing lead faction. He was leader of the opposing faction at the Battle of Loudoun Hill.
Right.
So really, Bruce was getting his own back for the Battle of Methven, where so many Scots had lost their lives. But it was just another example of Scots coming up against an opposition that far outweighed their own in terms of numbers. Valence's Earl of Pembroke's group were about 5 times the number of the Scots army at the Battle of Loudoun Hill. And there had already been previous battles that year. I mean, if we're thinking that the Battle of Loudoun Hill took place on the 10th of May, so in the first half of the year, there had already been the Battle of Turnberry, the Battle of Loch Ryan, the Battle of Glentrool, and then the Battle of Loudoun Hill just in the start of that year alone.
Wow.
Because we're right in the middle of the War of Independence.
Did all of those previous ones that year, did they also involve Aymer de Valence, the Pembroke?
No, not as far as I'm aware. I think his previous battle was the one that he'd won, being that at Methven.
Right.
And I mentioned before, like the Battle of Loudoun Hill isn't really talked about very often because it comes like 10 years after the Battle of Stirling Bridge. 7 years before Bannockburn, and of course those two battles are very well known. to anyone taking a wee glimpse at Scottish history. It is easy to get confused with because of Blind Harry, and was Wallace there, was he not? Is it the one in 1296 we're talking about? Is it the 1307? You know, it's... Unfortunately for Scotland, Edward I died very soon after the Battle of Loudoun Hill, leaving his incompetent son and to kind of take over, and he wasn't really into fighting with Scotland and came to a kind of resolution with Scots thereafter. He didn't fulfill his dad's kind of lasting wish either, did he? I think he was to take his bones on to further defeats of Scots. He was just buried down in Westminster, and Eddie II just kind of got on with life.
He just got on with life, yeah. You mentioned that Robert the Bruce had laid the ground, as it were. He'd prepared, he'd obviously worked out where he wanted to have this battle and how to inveigle the English troops.
Yeah, spent months preparing for that battle.
So I found it's from Wikipedia, you know, it's a plan of what happened.
We'll link to the Wikipedia page below if anybody wants to have a look while they're listening to this.
I was looking at it and I thought, wow, so the green bit at the top, the brighter green bit at the top, that's the hill, that represents the hill. So, and the three yellow groups, that's Bruce's men. And all the red ones lined up, coming towards him, as it were, that's the Earl of Pembroke's English forces. And you kind of look at it and you think, well, for goodness sake, who would do that? You know, who would just kind of line up like that? That's a surefire way to be able to pick off the English troops as they get nearer. And they're walking on a highway, but the pale green bits to either side of the red English army, that's actually bogland. So it was so clever, wasn't it? So not only did he kind of get him to go up the middle of that bog, but the two, if you look at then the two side bits, there's two greyer lines, and those you mentioned ditches, Jenny, and those represent where they think the ditches were. So even any of the English who got themselves into the bog and then out of it would come to no good, because it'd end up in one of his ditches. And I just thought, wow, that's a guy who's really, really good at military tactics and strategy, isn't it?
Yeah, and using the landscape as a weapon as well, isn't it?
Terrain tactics was absolutely one of Bruce's fortes. Like, definitely, he knew how to plan ahead and make the ground work for him. I mean, the battle just preceding this one, the Battle of Glentrool, that was almost a 300 style affair, because it said that 300 Scots came up against 1,500 English. But because of the way that Bruce wangled the terrain to his advantage, they were basically, it was the same kind of idea. They're literally forcing the English almost single file to come at them.
Yes.
So with that bottleneck effect, they don't have to deal with the entire army. They just have to deal with the few that
right in front.
You know, so.
Was that not the Stirling Bridge tactics?
That was the same kind of idea for Stirling Bridge. Yeah, exactly. Like 10 years previously.
Clever.
It is clever. It's not quite as infuriating as Culloden, say, you know, where you had Charlie as just... He just felt like he had a right to win. God was on their side. They were going to win. It didn't matter. No tactics were needed.
Yeah. You know, and I mean, when I was reading through about how he set up Loudoun Hill, of course, as you said, there's also that bottleneck effect that happened at Stirling Bridge. But he did the same at Bannockburn, did he? He had his men placed in a good spot, but he had also kind of laid traps and everything for the English, and once anyone did come off their horse, they were also going to find themselves in, you know, one or other of those wee burns, which we kind of think, well, it's just a wee burn, but presumably by the time you've got several thousand horses going over it and men going over it, it's going to be an absolute
your heavy armor.
Yeah.
Clearly they didn't learn from the experience, because they just kept walking into the same trap.
I suppose it is kind of hard to defeat a tactician that's able to use the ground to their benefit, because how do you defeat nature? I can understand like how the English would have been frustrated by that, but also not have any other real go-to in that situation. You know, it's not like they could go, no, right, okay, this doesn't work for us. Right, reschedule for next month, and we'll work out a better place. Okay, we'll work out somewhere more equal. We'll come at each other on more equal terms next time. Do you know what I mean? There was no kind of ability to have a redo. So once Bruce had got in there and laid the ground for his battle, and I assume he was one of those kind of leaders where you could see in his mind how this was going to play out to actively thwart any options that the English might have had, to really kind of make sure all his bases were covered. I would think he would have been quite a formidable person to come up against in battle. Plus the fact he wasn't just like a bookworm that sat there working out the best tactics. He worked it out knowing that it would work to the point where he was prepared to take active part in the battles. He was prepared to get in there with his men and prove that his tactics were going to win out, to prove that his own confidence in how the battle was going to go, I guess.
There's a knock-on effect then to confidence
their
among these
confidence.
men.
Oh, I don't know. It's quite a good kind of feeling to think about it, because you're thinking about the camaraderie. You're thinking about how everyone's in this together. I was going to say there's not split factions, but of course we know that there were Scots who were loyal to Balliol at the time, who was Edward I's pawn. Yeah. So it wasn't just English they were fighting. That's why I had to stop myself previously from saying the English faction, because it wasn't really the English faction. In a lot of things, right up until the 18th century, you had the Scots divided, didn't you? It's always hard. You can't get two Scotsmen to agree on anything.
They still do, don't we?
That's it. You find that a lot from a lot of the battles, where Scots were very rarely fighting just English foes. They were often fighting those of their own nationality who had been swayed or coerced or bribed into supporting the faction that was against their own kind of best interests. But again, that's just, we've not stopped doing that, have we?
Well, and it happened throughout England, didn't it? Whenever England started fighting itself, it was the same thing, the like Lancastrians and the Yorkists, and so there was Bruce and his men. So then they've got themselves in this really good position. Also, they've got the hill at the back of them. So, there was no way that they could be got at from either side or from behind. And then there's basically a slaughter, that kind of field in front of them, and the trackway and the bomb becomes a slaughter.
English confidence is going to have plummeted almost as soon as that battle started, just from the setup alone.
Apparently there's some evidence that after it got going, of course, all the action was happening at the front, but then the rest of the Pembroke and his men were pressing in behind. But by that time, the ones at the back had started to think, no, this isn't going to work, and took themselves away.
They were just lining up like cattle to the slaughter. They just had to put up a wee bit of a fight before their days suddenly was cut short.
Yes.
You can understand those men feeling like maybe it was more hassle than it was worth to continue, but they wouldn't have had a choice in the matter.
Oh, I know. That's true. Like, what was the immediate aftermath of winning this battle? I mean, how did that affect Bruce and his chances at that point?
Well, I mean, it obviously worked for them. Do you know what I mean? Every battle that they won led them on to greater confidence for the next, which is why this effectively tiny Scottish army kept going on to get wins right up until 7 years after at Bannockburn. I think that it was a confidence that was built every time they had one of these successes. It just added to more. So, and of course you had children growing up who weren't old enough to fight at Loudoun Hill, but they'd seen their fathers win, and they'd heard the reports. So these were becoming canon for Scottish children. This wasn't history that they were being taught. This was contemporary affairs, and they're being taught that it only takes a handful of Scots to win out against the military might of the English. And being brought up like that, you can understand that these children who've become men at Bannockburn, they're going to have been just in full confidence. There would have been no doubts in their minds that anything was possible. That England could try what they wanted. That even with Scots on the English side, it didn't seem to prevent true Scots, as they would have seen themselves, winning out against all odds, you know. And you can imagine that, can't you? You know, it's like a gambler. If you're going out and you're just winning every hand that you're playing, and you're maybe only losing the odd one, that they wee losses aren't going to have dented your confidence any. Do you know what I mean? Because you're going to be like, yeah, but I've won all them before, so let's just continue and see how this plays out, you know, like.
Yeah.
So hopefully somewhere at the moment in Scotland is a master tactician who's just working out how to get, you know, a small number of rather fractious people who are prone to argue with each other at the drop of a hat to come together to, you know, knock spots off them.
Absolutely.
So Jenny, thank you so much for coming. Really, really enjoyed talking to you, and it's great that we ask you to do these things and you just say yes and appear. And
of course.
Coming up, our next guests are Neil and Lynne, who both attended the ceremony on the anniversary of the Battle of Loudoun Hill. Welcome to our guests, Lynne Dougan and Neil Haston. So what was it like being on Loudoun Hill?
When we had climbed right up to the top of the hill and looking down, and you're going, ooh, that's where it was there. Over here, and then you got the idea, like, I mean, this hills, you know, really stands out, obviously, because it's like it is a volcanic plug. Everything else is just eroded away around it, and this bit sticks right up in the middle, and you're looking down and you can see why the battleground was kind of chosen, because again, and I think that's quite true of lots of battles in Scottish history, is that those on the Scots side are going, well, we know the land, we know the lie of the land, we know what's there, we know if it's marshy ground, so if people are coming in on cavalry, well, they're going to get stuck in that.
That's exactly what Jenny was saying, that the tactics involved were to do with the landscape.
Yeah, she was saying she thinks Bruce was a master strategist in that respect. Well, and in a way, he had to be. He didn't have as many men. He didn't have anything like as many men, and they weren't so well armed either. But what you said just now is just gets it in a nutshell, doesn't it? That he knew the land. There must be a way of drawing the enemy towards you as well, because you know why? Well, why would they bother? Really? Why?
Let's put your diagram up, Marlene.
Put that up then. The bright green bits at the top, that's the hill, and the three yellow squares are where he had drawn up, where Bruce had drawn up the Scots. So the Scots are in yellow, and then all the red bits, so that whole line of them, that's the English. So of course you look at that and you think, well, what on earth was? It was the Earl of Pembroke who was in charge, and he's like, well, what was he doing? Because they're just gonna pick off the front bunch, and then there'll be the next bunch, and then and it's because they're on a roadway that's relatively solid. Either side, that sort of lighter green colour, that's bog, and right over at the both sides, you can see there's two sort of lines there. But well, that was Bruce had got his men to dig ditches there, so even if any of the English got through the bog, they were still going to get stuck in the ditches. How did he get them to go there?
The hill that we're up's really steep. It's like it's a volcanic rock basically. So, but the battle is across the river on a sort of very flat area. And so it's not actually on. Backing up onto Loudoun Hill as we were up it. It's a few hundred metres anyway away.
Presumably, though, whatever is sitting behind the Scottish soldiers is solid ground with a bit of cover on it, is it?
When you look at it, it looks like it is a slight hill.
Yeah.
So they'll be coming from the road onto this flat area. They'll see the Scots ahead on a wee bit of hill, and then they've got all this bother of digging and stuff, and way in advance, and they've just drawn them straight in and up and into it, you know.
So who all was there when you were there? Because I saw a flag from the Wallace Society. I saw the Robert the Bruce Society, but it was also Static Saltires. How come these groups all got together?
The static saltire group's a fairly new one. This is Brian Cunningham. And basically, he's been coordinating a lot of the stuff recently. So he's based up in Dundee and Aberdeen mainly. I met him in Dundee. But he's now focusing on all the information he can get about any event that's on a Saturday. So he posted the one about Stirling as well. And so we met up again in Stirling.
But what was interesting was after we'd been there and been up the hill and had a look around and came home and watched Outlaw King.
Oh yeah, I found that. I was just Googling "Got Loudoun Hill" and found Netflix Outlaw King.
Yeah, and because the hills actually, it actually features in the film, and then when it comes to the battle scene, it is pretty gory and brutal. And as you say, the Scots were, from my little bit of research on it, Bruce had about 600 men, and the Earl of Pembroke had 3,000.
Wow.
Including cavalry. It wasn't just infantry.
Yeah.
So they had well outweighed in terms of size. However, what they had done, and it's almost like it's quite rudimentary. They had chopping down trees and sharpening them to make spikes and then sticking them in the ground. But because there was that slight dip, you couldn't see them. So coming down, they didn't know what they were approaching. And when they've got these cavalry, I mean, it's just, as an animal lover, it's horrible watching the film as these horses are going over and being impaled. And but then it takes you back to kind of the Battle of Bannockburn as well. And I remember reading about that. And they used the caltrops, which are like the kind of three-pointed devices that they just chucked into the ground so that people were going to stand on it. And it didn't matter which way they landed, there was always a spike sticking up. So as cavalry and foot soldiers.
I mean, before we spoke to Jenny about to get some more background about the battle, I was Googling, ended up on Wikipedia as you normally then do, and just reading about it. And actually, what struck me, what came into my mind was just, well, I know this. So this is 1307, so another 7 years before Bannockburn. But you got the impression that what Bruce learned from what he did at near Loudoun Hill must have stood him in good stead, because it's the same, isn't he, at Bannockburn?
He's already done it before. He's already done it at Glentrool as well.
Yes, and at Bannockburn he kind of pulled the English towards him, and then there's various burns that are there, and there's also stake holes and everything that he set up. So you can kind of see that warfare techniques. Yeah,
it seems that the English have always got the equivalent of this enormous cavalry contingent that we don't ever have.
Yeah.
And so projecting forward as well, when you look at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, it's exactly the same sort of thing.
We thought that,
I don't think it's an area. It's an area where there has been any, proper archaeological digs done. But someone in I don't know whether it's Historic Scotland or maybe just a local council archaeologist is being looked at just to kind of assess it, because you'd think, with that, when it happened there, there's bound to be stuff under the ground that they could get.
Even a metal detector or something.
Well, you suspect metal detectorists might have been there, but I don't know if any of the soldiers, either the Scots or the English, were buried there. But there might be.
Yes, that's supposed to be what's the area called that we looked over? Wallace's
grave or cairn. I'm just looking at the archaeological site. It usually comes up at Canmore.
Yes,
and they do have stuff there, but it's all about the Roman fort that's there as well.
Oh.
Well, it's a kind of an obvious place, isn't it? As a fortified spot, whether you're a Roman or Iron Age Pict or something.
Oh, and views, panoramic views as well. You see anybody coming to you.
When you were talking about having the detectorists out, when we were there was a man with his metal detector, and I was like, "Oh, have you found anything?" And he's like, "No, I'm looking for my wedding ring. I lost it last year."
And all I found is this massive sword.
Have either of you fathomed where Wallace comes into this? I mean, we had a bit of a chat about that with Jenny, because Wallace, in 1307, Wallace had died 2 years before. Well, he'd been executed 2 years before, so he certainly wasn't at that battle. But he seems to be terribly associated with it.
If you Wikipedia it, they're trying to actually put down his connection to the area. So on the one hand, you've got the geographical references to him being there, but then it's kind of disputed whether he was there or not. And it's not a major battle he's involved in. This is more an ambush that he's involved in, where he hears of supplies coming up from England along this main route. So he does an ambush on the route. And
so that must have been some while before.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
that's interesting, because what Jenny was telling us was she thought there had been an earlier Battle of Loudoun, and involving Wallace. This had only come from Blind Harry, which she kind of dismissed as legend rather than fact. Yeah. But his name is there, and these things come from somewhere, don't they?
Well, that's right. And it's not a huge battle, but it is another battle, and it's a massacre, effectively. And this is where he buries all the English in these mounds that we refer to.
So that could have been burials from the earlier skirmish.
Was he not like William Wallace of Elderslie?
Yeah, Paisley. Yeah,
and that's not too far away from this location. They picked their battle sites. I mean, when I watched Outlaw King, and I'd remembered doing it a little bit. I didn't do history at school. You had to do it in first and second year. You got no choice in it.
Yeah.
And it was awful. It was so boring. The school I went to had part of the Antonine Wall literally across the road in Callender Park. Did we get taken out to see it? No. And what they taught us in history, it was all kind of like Second World War, American Civil War, and you're like,
if you got taught that, you were lucky. I got taught Henry VII, and the court of Star Chamber, which I know nothing more about it than the name these days. Of course, I dropped history as fast as I could after those 2 years, which actually now, I think, well, I mean, I was fine and I enjoyed doing geography instead, but I think, well, what a shame, because it just put me off completely.
When you think about it, it's like, well, what was being taught in the curriculum then now? Neil, you loved history, but you had a really good teacher who brought it to life for you.
Yeah.
So that made the difference. Yeah. Scottish history is dampened down. Why are we not teaching the wars of independence? Doesn't really come into the curriculum, and you're like, it's part of our history, and the lessons to be learned from that, particularly now what's going on. Okay, it's different methodology that's being used, but the same principles are being applied to keep the Scots, in their box type of thing.
And unaware of what their own people had been doing in the past.
But if they don't teach you the history, you can't learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely. This might be a good point to mention that we have a Scottish history playlist on our YouTube channel. And not only does that have clips from Loudoun Hill and Wallace's Cave that we visited a couple of weeks ago and various other bits, it's also got the whole series of Radical Scottish History podcast, which is an excellent series, and it is filling that gap of what was Scottish history about, done by somebody who was on the side of the Scots, as opposed to, the official version. So if anybody's interested in knowing more about our own history, you'll find it on that playlist. Did it have an atmosphere, the place? Sometimes places where there's been battles have a kind of
sort of look and feel about it, because it's a volcanic rock. It's a bit like Edinburgh Castle or Salisbury Crags and Aberseat in Edinburgh, that kind of the same sort of feel. It's scree and rough, and usually you've got sheep, and if you go in and explore these areas, it's full of wildlife and sheep tracks and ruined buildings and all sorts of stuff hidden in the woods, and so it has a very distinctive sort of feeling. And if once you venture to a very steep top, then the panorama from the top is incredible.
But it was a wee bit hazy looking out to the west, but you could see Arran clearly. So again, as a kind of vantage point.
And I mean, we know as far back as the Roman fort was there, so it was obviously a strategic point for them. But you would imagine they would have lookouts and all sorts on the hill itself. That would be the first.
That would be the first thing. Yeah.
That was really nice. The fact that you were actually there and you can report back from what you saw and what you felt.
It's an absolutely cracking day.
Yeah, it looked like it.
It looked beautiful.
Have you seen the list of battles in Scotland that we've got to go to? It's an endless task.
I mean, like many people in my age in Scotland, I didn't get taught any Scottish history. You hear mention of the Battle of Loudoun Hill and you go, where was that? When was that?
Yeah.
Who was fighting who? Yeah.
So this is us doing our little bit to put that right.
Well, I wouldn't say we were now experts, Fiona, about
bit better informed though.
Much better informed. I just really enjoyed, the chats that we've had to put this together, and I hope other people are appreciating it as well.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye now.
And we'll be back again next Friday with another episode. And don't forget, if you'd like to see video versions of our podcasts, you can get them on our YouTube channel, which is Scottish Independence Podcasts, Indypod Extra.